This is Nan McKay, and I would like to introduce you today to James Stockard, referred to as Jim. He's been involved in housing on many levels. In 2019, he delivered a lecture in Glasgow for the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe Conference on City Living. He was a visiting lecturer in Shanghai, China. He was also a lecturer in housing in the Harvard Graduate School of Design, responsible for all aspects of teaching graduate level courses in housing, community development, and neighborhood revitalization. For many years, he was curator of the Loeb Fellowship, Harvard Graduate School of Design, that brings 10 mid-level or mid-career, I suppose we should say, professionals concerned with the built and natural environment to Harvard for a year of independent study. In addition, he worked on public housing in a variety of ways, including an operating cost study, a troubled housing authority study, which led to placing the housing authority in receivership, and as a consultant to housing authorities on Hope 6. He has been a consultant in affordable housing development to community development corporations, nonprofits, church groups, and public agencies. So welcome, Jim Stockard.
Thank you, Nan. Nice to be here.
Now, you're a fellow in the Academy of Housing and Communities, and you were selected then as one of the men and women who have forged public policy and the direction of housing and communities. You've been a teacher, a consultant, and even a commissioner in the housing and community development field. So let's dig into some of this experience. In the past few years, you've been lecturing around the world. So tell us a little more about your topics.
Well, since I'm not an academic, but rather a practitioner, I speak and teach out of my lived experience. And that experience includes a long career as a housing consultant, as you've suggested, and a number of roles in the public sector. So typically, I talk about affordable housing. Sometimes that's the topic I'm asked to speak about. Sometimes I need to work my way around to that topic as a description of issues in the housing field in general. I feel that housing is and should be a human right. And so I always have some conversations with people in various venues about that right. The talk I gave in Scotland was a second version of a talk I'd given earlier, which is called "We Need a Homes Policy, Not a Housing Policy." I feel strongly that those of us in the housing arena, those of us with professional roles, sometimes forget that what we're really doing is trying to generate homes for people where they can nurture their families, they can feel safe and secure, where they can afford the price of that, what's in a good location for them. But what's most important is that it's a home for them. Housing is many other things. It's an investment, it's a commodity, it's a tax base, it's a voting address, it's a address to deliver utilities and amenities to. But I think the most important part of housing is home. So I generally try to talk about how we produce more homes for more people in ways that work for them.
So in thinking about the United States, would you say that we subscribe to the policy of housing or home as a right?
Absolutely not. We have in our case, we have a housing policy which is a lottery essentially. We have about enough financial assistance for people who can't afford housing in the marketplace to serve about a quarter of those who need it. So that means we're leaving 3/4 of families to either live in very inadequate housing, to pay way too much for that housing, or frankly, to be homeless. So I consider our country's policies in the housing arena to be woefully inadequate. We are well behind many other nations in the world in caring about our citizens. So it does concern me a lot, and I teach and talk about that a good deal.
So, what are some of your thoughts on the last 50 years of public policy in this area?
Well, it's not a very good set of thoughts, frankly, Nan. We have been, you might begin it with the general notion of the assistance for housing, which has been so inadequate. I primarily blame the Senate and the House of Representatives for that. They have simply never allocated the amount of funding necessary to serve all of our people. And I fear, frankly, that inadequacy, that inability of the Congress to agree on funding levels for our population is a lot about but unconscious or sometimes conscious biases about class and race in our country. And so I mostly lay the responsibility of that at the feet of the Congress. And of course, that means that we citizens have to look at ourselves. If we had demanded that the Congress do that, they would have done it because they like to keep getting elected. So we probably haven't made our voice loud enough about these issues. Beyond that, I would say that we have struggled to find the right programs to provide this housing for people. We have badly crippled the public housing program so that what is in its essence perhaps the simplest and cleanest and clearest way to provide good housing for people, but we've crippled it in so many different ways that it can't really do its job in most places. There are some dramatic exceptions to that. Several housing authorities around the country who are exceptional in this regard. But then in the other categories, we've developed a very, very complicated system of subsidies for housing, low-income housing tax credit, which is our best system right now for producing affordable housing, but it relies on a whole series of niche professional improvement professions, lawyers, accountants, syndicators. It needs to provide more profits for American corporations in order to get the money into the hands of people who are developing affordable housing. So we've been way too complicated. We've been way too inadequate. And in general, we've not used what we think we're good at, which is innovation, to solve this housing problem for a very large part of our population.
When you say the biases against class and race, when you talk about class, are you thinking that maybe people are against low-income people or people that they may perceive are on welfare? Is that what you mean by class?
Yes, I think that is a general rule. Our Congress does not, and many of our administrations, not all, but many of them have not been responsible enough to our populations that have modest means. And much of the issues around housing relates to where it will be located. And as you well know, Nan, the NIMBYs of our world fight hard against housing that they perceive to be dangerous to their property values. And then they stop many affordable housing developments from occurring in places that would be desirable locations. So there's plenty of responsibilities to go around. But yes, I believe that people worry that people of modest means and people of color may harm their property values. And so they would not like that housing to either get very much of our national budget or to be located very close to them. So I don't suggest that that's all of what's going wrong, and I don't suggest that everybody has those feelings by any stretch. But I do believe those two issues are at the core of a lot of our problems with inadequate response to the housing needs in the country.
When we look back over that 50 years we were talking about, what lessons have we or should we have learned? I mean, I can think of one of them, and that's high rises for children that we used to build that way, that we have pretty well gone into less density. What other lessons do you think maybe we have found along the way?
Well, Nan, one thing that I feel strongly about is the notion that one size does not fit all. One of our problems has been trying to produce a national program which we dole out to local communities 3,500 public housing authorities and almost the same number of CDCs that build affordable housing under one of the other programs. But those programs have come with a set of regulations which have hemmed them in and made them not as effective as they might have been if we really did turn it over to local officials. And I can cite, for example, in the housing arena, many housing authorities do a sort of an adequate job. They're currently only receiving 82% of what they're supposed to receive in terms of the formula that HUD uses, but HUD hasn't given the money, so they can't hand it out to the housing authorities. And they struggle to do a good job. On the other hand, housing authorities, many of those who are in the Moving to Work program, but the ones I know about, Cambridge Housing Authority in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I served on the board for many years, the King County Housing Authority out around Seattle, the Portland Housing Authority in Portland, Oregon, the St. Paul Housing Authority in Minnesota, and others of that kind are doing wonderful work because of their creativity and their willingness to bend the rules to the purpose that they are created for, which is to provide as much long-term affordable housing for as many people as they can. And those authorities demonstrate the fact that if we would let the creative authorities have some more freedom, they would do more about solving this problem than we think the housing authorities are able to do. And the same is true for nonprofit organizations. They have lots of capacity and lots of creativity, but they're hamstrung by regulations in ways that keep them from maximizing that creativity. So I really do believe that one of the lessons we should have learned is provide some money and trust local people to do what works well in their community. And the corollary to that, Nan, is that because some of those local entities will do badly, do poorly. And so there need to be consequences for failure. It's been one of the problems in our industry for many, many years, is organizations have been allowed to fail with no consequences. And I think that's unconscionable. And that responsibility, I'm afraid, lies at the feet of HUD, who has failed to regulate. They've over-regulated in areas where they shouldn't regulate, and they've under-regulated in areas where they should have regulated. So I've had some sad experience with that. But I do think that if we learn that lesson to trust the local folks, give them freedom, let them operate, that they will do generally a good job. And when they don't, we should land on them hard.
So are you thinking something more like the Community Development Block Grant Program, but for housing instead?
Well, that sort of concept makes some sense to me. You know, in the early days of public housing, fundamentally, the federal government said, we have money, what do you want to do? And a local housing authority would come to them and say, well, we found a site here in town, and I think we can build about 100 homes here. And so HUD would say, okay, 100 homes times X amount of money, you should have this much money. And they got a grant and built a housing, end of story. Later on, we figured out that the original rent formula wasn't so good. And so we had to change the rent formula to an operating subsidy, but that's still quite simple compared to the low-income housing tax credit, for example, which I'm a fan of, don't get me wrong, but it's way too complicated, and I would like us to do it more simply. So that system, that business of saying, here's the money we have to build some new affordable housing, who would like some? And HUD could entertain applications from for-profit organizations, from nonprofit organizations, and public agencies to build this housing. I do not like the idea of for-profit organizations owning housing for the long term. I think that's dangerous for especially our big cities, but they're good developers generally, and so I'd be happy for them to build the housing, but I would like it to be owned by nonprofit and public agencies. And I think, yes, if we said we have X billion dollars available this year, who would like some, and took proposals from local entities and left them to do their work, that would be a simpler and more effective way of going about it.
And although the tax credit is a good program, you know, the question is, should it really be the only program we currently have to produce in project-based housing?
Right. It's an attractive program in many ways. It produces equity, which is what the original public housing program did for housing authorities. It does get money into the public housing, the affordable housing arena that doesn't show up on the spending side of the federal government. It does show up on the revenue side, but it doesn't show up on the spending side, which means it's politically easier to accomplish. And I'm not suggesting we eliminate any programs. Part of the problem right now is that, as I suggested, we've only got about enough subsidies for 25% of the people who need them. So every resource we have to get money. If you like the tax credit program, let's double the tax program. If you like the public housing program, let's double the public housing program. If you like the Section 8 program, let's double the Section 8 program. I'm an all-in person on these things. I think we housing people spend a lot too much time fighting with each other about which program is a better program. They're all useful programs, and those who are good at each one should do that one, and we should fund them all in generous ways.
Or tie it back into the community and the local level, as you say, because I can think, even though the voucher is a very good program, the housing voucher, in some communities, the rents are so high, it's almost getting priced out of the market. And yet there's nothing else they can do except maybe try a tax credit in order to get more units. So it's hard.
Here in Cambridge, for example, 50% of all the housing vouchers that the housing authority hands out are among those that are used, 50% of them are used outside of Cambridge because our prices in Cambridge are so high. So that is and I'm glad for the mobility because it does allow people to do that. But the idea of those things was to help people in your own community. So it's difficult when again regulations constrain that kind of behavior by local authorities.
So of all the things that you've done, what do you consider your biggest success story? Well,
I am proudest of several involvements, Nan. I was proud of the public housing operating cost study that we did back in the late 90s. I think we moved public housing more toward the kind of real estate arrangement that is typical in the other 95% of the real estate in America. We made it more rational and responsible. I liked the work we did. Many housing authorities didn't quite understand what we were doing, and it's hard to measure the success of that when Congress only gives the housing authorities 82% of what the formula calls for them to have. But I do believe that a critical element in the public housing arena is to make it function like regular real estate in this country. Can you imagine, Nan, a program where you start a real estate program and the housing authorities are not allowed to have an item in their operating budget for capital improvements? For 30 years, they cannot budget for capital improvements. That's sort of housing 101. You don't get into the business unless you understand that. And yet that's the regimen the housing authorities have had to deal with for all these years. Can you imagine creating a housing program where you have no line item for resident services? Can you imagine creating a real estate program where people pay 30% of their rent and then the subsidy to match that only goes to a modest level of operating cost? It was a not well-designed program. And I think that a part of what our study did was to bring that back to a more reasonable way of understanding real estate. And it was in some ways, mostly through Greg Byrne, the wonderful functionary guy at HUD, who was the project director for the operating cost study. In some ways, our study was a precursor of RAD. RAD got compromised before it was finally developed, but that was the way of beginning to think that we could put housing authorities on a better footing financially. I'm also proud, Nan, of the opportunity I had to serve the Washington, D.C. Housing Authority as a special master under Judge Stephen Gray back in the early part of the century. that was a very troubled housing authority when I went to work on it. The day I arrived, of the 12,000 apartments that the Washington City Housing Authority had, 3,000 were vacant. Fully 15,000 people were behind in their rent. I'm sorry, 5,000 people were behind in their rents, many by very substantial amounts. The DC Housing Authority had been on the troubled authority list for 17 years without ever having been removed or there being any consequences in Washington. And the numbers are, I forget this number a little bit, but it's pretty close. In the previous 17 years, the DC Authority had something like 13 executive directors. Again, with no consequences of any kind. And I tried hard in that assignment not to recommend a receivership, because I think that the cities don't learn anything when there's a receiver who takes over. But David Gilmour, essentially, the mayor left us no choice, the judge and I in that case. And we've ultimately had to go to a receiver, and David Gilmour did a very, very good job. And I believe that authority is in much, much better shape today than it was when it started. And I get only a small amount of credit for that, Nan. Let me be clear. The judge gets the most credit and David gets the most credit. And I was honored to have a little role in pushing the ball up the hill a little bit till we could get it to the point where the judge could make some good decisions and David could go to work. And lastly, I again, in the public housing arena, I was proud to be able to serve as a commissioner of the Cambridge Housing Authority for 40 years, an authority that, and again, my role is very, very minor. The giants like Harry Spence and Dan Winchell and Greg Russ, now Michael Johnston, get the lion's share of the credit. But in the days before I had an opportunity to serve there, the authority was in very, very bad shape, bankrupt, full of corruption, full of nepotism, voted the second worst housing authority in Massachusetts by the Massachusetts Association of Public Housing Tenants. And today it's a really exceptional authority. Ask anybody who knows this industry and they will ask them for the 5 best authorities in the country, and Cambridge will be on that list somewhere. So it was a pleasure and a privilege to be able to sit and watch that happen and play only, again, a tiny role in that occurrence. So I guess a large part of my feelings of pride about my professional life have to do with public housing.
What were some of the biggest challenges that you faced in your role?
Well, a challenge, the challenge in the public housing operating cost study, frankly, was the authority's inability to we had an advisory committee of public housing directors, and they had a very hard time understanding the concept of how we were doing the study. And I believed intensely in that study. I won't bore you and your listeners with the nature of the science about that, but the way we were doing it was exactly right in my mind. And I was never able, I was a failure at being able to explain that in ways the housing authority director could understand. I was frustrated. Many of them were my good friends. I worked with some of them in their authorities and in their professional organizations. But I was not able to explain the study in a successful way to them. And I think they were unhappy with it, perhaps right to the end. And again, it's hard for them to evaluate it now when they're getting 82% of what they should be getting. So in DC, to be candid, the biggest frustration there was the mayor of DC, who was determined to keep this organization under her political thumb in very, some cases, illegal ways. And frankly, we didn't get much help from HUD in that scenario. They would have asked us to calm down and accept more or less the status quo. And so I felt that wasn't a big thing, but it was something that was, I was unhappy that turned out to be a problem. And I have to tell you, Nan, at the Cambridge Housing Authority, I had very, very few things that were troublesome. The city managers left us alone. Politics stayed entirely out of the housing authority. We board members understood right from the start what our role was as opposed to the director's role. So when city councilors in those very early days called me and said, Jim, I got somebody that needs an apartment, all of us board members, the standard answer was call the executive director and he'll tell you about the process. Pretty soon they stopped calling us because they realized it was a wasted phone call. And it is dramatic, Nan, what can happen if you leave good professionals alone to do their professional work and keep the politics out of it. And our city managers over the years in Cambridge and our city council, our city managers have been that way from the start. They appointed good board members. They supported us. And when we had little tricky situations, they stood by us. And the city councilors usually learned pretty quickly what the right role was for them. You know, they have things to do. They have constituents to represent. We're happy for them to talk to Dan and make their case and help their constituents make their best case for an emergency standing or what have you. But the essential answer was get out of our way and let us do our job. Let us understand as board members what our role is, not to run the authority, but to make policy, and leave Dan and Greg and Harry free to run the agency as good professionals. And once that was established in the first couple of years, it was just nothing but a pleasure to be able to serve on that board and watch these great professionals do remarkable things.
It's interesting to see how things have changed over the last few years. Think as it relates to politics and the involvement of cities or city government within the housing authority. It used to be that as they were set up under state legislation, that it was a kind of a separate entity. It was more a public corporation over on the side to protect it from politics. And now we have almost the opposite in some cities. In some cities, every time there's a new mayor, the housing authority director is required to resign. And that's just such a difference in how it was originally set up.
Again, Nan, let me just say, the point where we fail the most in the public arena, in my mind, is when any of us substitute our personal agenda, whether for friends, for our advancement, for whatever our motivation is, whenever we substitute that for the purposes of the public agency in question. In the case of the Housing Authority, its agenda is only one thing: to develop and manage first-class housing for people of modest means on a permanent basis. And anybody else's agenda, oh, I need to get a job for somebody to advance my political career. Oh, I have a good friend that needs an apartment. Oh, I have a need to serve this particular neighborhood better than that neighborhood, so stay out of this neighborhood, or whatever it might be. Any of those agenda, when they're substituted for the agenda of the agency, and you could go right through every city department and every state department, every federal department. It's true for the police department, the fire department, and the public works department. They have a mission, and when political actors do something other than make policy about that mission, they are corrupting the purposes of public agency. And then it's no surprise that the public loses comfort in those agencies. And I particularly fear with housing authorities, again, that bias that comes from thinking that those are just poor people. And in some cases, those are just people of color. And they don't matter as much. They don't vote as much. And so if I need to substitute my agenda for their agenda, for the Housing Authority's agenda, that's really okay, because it won't hurt me politically. And besides, that's just those people. And I find that reprehensible. And one of the reasons I'm so proud of Cambridge is that never happened in Cambridge. We never had a suggestion that we need to do something for some political purpose.
Let's talk a little bit about the Loeb Scholarship Program. You spent many years working with that program at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. What was the course of study?
Well, it's a good example, Nan, of one size doesn't fit all. There was no course of study. Every year we had between 100 and 150 applications for 10 spots. The people were in the middle of their careers. They had shown clearly some leadership potential at some level. we invited the 10 that were selected for that year to come to Harvard. We gave them a place to live and a modest stipend. And most of them had to tighten their belt just a little bit. And then they were free agents. They could take any course they wanted to at Harvard or MIT, or they could take no courses. They could write, they could read, they could interview professors, they could meet with students, whatever they needed to do to take the next step in their career. Many of them wanted to just take a breather, and they'd been so busy, so frantically demanded by everybody in their arena that they needed some time to think, because they had found themselves, as many people do, dragged along in your career. You're good, so after you get a first job, and then somebody sees you and pulls you over to their agency, and somebody promotes you to this place, and people wake up suddenly at the age of 40 and say, whoa, I didn't plan any of this, and here I am. And now that I've got a little experience under my belt, I'm not sure this is exactly what I want to be doing. I want to be not at the local level, I want to work the national level, or I don't want to work in the for-profit world anymore. I'd like to do some nonprofit work, or I'd like to be in the public arena for a while. So this was an opportunity for the fellows to think, to consider their future, to build the skills they needed to accomplish that future. And I would say to them at the beginning of their tenure, I would say just what I'm saying to you: there are no really requirements this year. You're free to study where you want, to interact with who you want, to contemplate, find a place to study. There's only one requirement from this fellowship. When you leave and go back to your working world, you have to change the world. And so when I said that at first, I would always get some chuckles, and they would laugh, and it was funny. And by the time they got to the end of their tenure, they knew I was dead serious. And many of them have gone on to oftentimes at a different level of service, as I suggested, but almost inevitably in a more powerful and potent way. Harvard is many things, Dan. It is generally not exactly what everybody thinks it is from far away, but it is undeniably a credential. Whether it should be or not, it is. And for many people who come, we, for example, didn't really care about your academic history at all. We had many exceptional fellows, some of whose names you would know, who don't even have a college degree. But their leadership abilities had been clear in their profession up to the time they were a Loeb Fellow. And not for all of them, but for some of those people, this business of having a Harvard something or other on your resume is very significant for the future of their careers. And for some of them, many would come into my office soon after they arrived on campus, and they would say, gosh, Jim, I'm delighted to be here. It's really a wonderful opportunity, but it seems like there must have been a mistake. I'm not really good enough to have something like this, am I, or qualified. By the end of their year, they realized that we were smarter than they were. We knew this about them. But by the time they get to the end of the year, they would say, well, here I am at Harvard, this august university, and people listen to me. I can play in this league. Maybe I should have some ambitions for things I'd like to do in my career that I hadn't really thought about before, but I realize that I have some value, some worth, and people care about my opinions. And that validation for either self or for others about you was always a wonderful thing about the fellowship. And we had many fellows, if you will, step out after their year here to take on new roles with more ability to impact the world. So it's a spectacular fellowship. Every field should have this. We focused on people working on the natural and built environment. So they were landscape architects, city planners. But we also had, for example, journalists who wrote about the city, public artists who did their art in the city, CDC officials who worked in neighborhoods. So we had lots of people who didn't have one of those 3 credentials that the GSD gives out professionally. But we generally, and we had a few lawyers over the years, but the legal profession should have something like this. The medical profession should have something like this. This idea about getting to the middle of your career and pausing for a moment at what I sometimes refer to as kind of a crossroads is incredibly valuable for people. I was very, very proud to have a role in that program for 17 years. I have made some wonderful, wonderful friends in that program that I stand still in awe of as they they make an impact on the world.
What projects or fields of endeavor did you enjoy the most?
Well, I've talked to you about my public housing work, which I really loved. But the other thing that I've done a lot of, Dan, and that I feel pretty good about is teaching. When I had a local fellowship myself many years ago, long before I was a curator. And the thing I learned during that year about myself, that year of pause about myself, was that I really did enjoy teaching. And so when I went back to my firm, my consulting firm, where I'd been doing housing development deals and housing consulting, I continued to do some of that. But I also sought opportunities and had opportunities to do more teaching and training about housing matters. And so because of things I learned from my wife, I taught a lot about property management. I taught a lot about housing development for affordable housing. I taught a lot about community development activities. And then I've been able to teach at the GSD since 1997. And at several other universities before that, and from time to time during that period. And I do love to teach. Long before my age, but certainly when you get to a certain age, you become very anxious. If you think the work you've been doing has had value and it's worth doing in the world, then you're very anxious to find out the young people coming along behind you who will take over for you and do that work. And that's been my great privilege, is to teach and over the years know a number of those people go on to begin playing bigger and bigger roles in the housing world. And it just delights me to know that I may have contributed just a little bit to their ability to do that work well and be better than I was at each age that I see them.
What do you feel is the biggest challenge that we're facing today in housing and communities?
Well, I do want us to, is generally, Nan, I would say, it is pursuing this notion of housing as a right. I think it is within our grasp. I think we could do this if we wanted to do it. And that's a political question of finding the right people to support those programs in office. It's an issue of mounting enough energy in the public to demand that kind of service. There is some more education to be done. I don't think nearly enough people understand the linkage between good housing and health, good housing and energy, good housing and education, good housing and racial equity. So I think there is much to be done as spreaders of the gospel, if you will, as political activists, and as continuing to work on finding the variety of programs that will do that well. Do we have to focus all of our energy on let's just do public housing or let's just have more low-income housing? I don't think so. I think we're better off if we have a number of those programs, letting various groups take advantage of the programs that they can do. I do think, one thing I haven't mentioned very much, but I will say this because I think it's pretty important nationwide. Our zoning regimens at the local level are a big barrier to building more affordable housing. And I'm a kind of a radical on this issue. While I really do want local communities to create their own solutions, I do believe that we need to lean on local communities a little bit, because I think that the needs are clear for affordable housing, and the political difficulties at the local level are hard. It's hard for local politicians to be in favor of affordable housing. I can tell you one or two stories about here in Cambridge where I thought political actors were extremely brave to take on the fight for affordable housing. And so I'm a favor. Oregon has a statute, the Urban Growth Boundary Statute, that requires local communities to zone enough land for multifamily housing that it could meet their 10% quota if developers came in and filled it up. Massachusetts has a statute, 40B, which you may know, that allows the state to override local zoning if they haven't met the 10% standard. So I think some nudges like that of one kind or another from the state government, not the state, the feds, ultimately, to say to local communities, look, you figure out how to do it, but you got to do it. You can't just shut the door behind you and say it's not our problem. every community in the country, man, needs some affordable housing, because every community's got some retail establishments or commercial establishments that employ people of modest means. In most cities and towns in the country, as you well know, starting teachers, starting firemen, starting policemen qualify for affordable housing. So every town needs it. And the ability to say, nope, not in our place, someplace else, I think is something that we need to worry about and encourage towns and cities. And if they're unable to do it on their own, then we might need to have a little nudge from a higher level of government.
Were some of those activists that you're talking about, that you said you had some stories of in Cambridge, were some of those younger people?
Well, not particularly, no. The first person I think about is the wonderful city councilor, then state rep, our friend Alice Wolf. And my neighborhood, where I physically live in Cambridge, doesn't have much affordable housing. And when the housing authority, I was on the board at the time, and the housing authority found a little piece of land that we thought we could build a few homes on. There was a neighborhood meeting, and it's a pretty liberal neighborhood, but still you could see the buzz in the room. It was not it didn't look like it was going to be a very pleasant evening. I was in the back of the room and monitoring, and Alice stood up before anybody said a word, and she was wildly popular in our neighborhood. She said, listen, I'm here to make sure that the housing authority and the neighbors work well on the design so that we find something that's compatible, but I'm strongly in favor of this housing being built on this site, and I want this neighborhood to know that I'm an advocate of this. And that's the kind of stance that many politicians would have run away from like crazy. They wouldn't even have shown up for the meeting, much less stand up and say that they were in favor of it. And at the time, Alice was probably 60, 55 or 60. But she was just a courageous, strong politician who voted her conscience all the time, and I enormously admired her. Right now, we are proposing an affordable housing overlay in Cambridge. And again, I would say the little committee that's working on this with a lot of energy has one very young person on it, but except for Chris, most of the rest of us on that committee are sort of veterans of the housing fight in Cambridge. And a little bit older. So I do believe our young folks will rally around these issues when they have the opportunity. And our city councilors who are standing firm for this new overlay includes several of our youngest city councilors. So I'm not at all suggesting that young folks aren't ready to get in the fight here at all. It just happens to be the stories I was telling are not so much younger people.
If there's a life lesson that you could pass along to some of those younger people, what would it be?
Well, Dan, it's reminiscent of a question somebody asked me at a lecture I did several years ago. The short answer to that is that I am a big, huge fan of the phrase that Martin Luther King often quoted: the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And so my message to younger folks is fight like crazy for these important social justice issues that you really believe in strongly. And know that from time to time you will not prevail. The forces of status quo, the forces of excess capitalism, the forces of white supremacy will defeat you from time to time, but you cannot give up. There was a time in this country when women couldn't vote. And there were a few crazy women who started saying, I think it would be a good idea if women were allowed to vote. There was a time in this country when Black people were slaves. And some people said that ought to change. There was a time in this country when gay people could not marry. And slowly, by no means on a straight line, have we accomplished some of those important social objectives. So one of my messages to young people is don't give up. Do not quit. When you get knocked down or when you lose a battle, get into the back room, calm yourself down, have a glass of wine or whatever it is, strategize, think about it. one of the important things that we've accomplished several kinds of things in Massachusetts by virtue of bringing together unusual coalitions. We have an act that provides money in local communities for several purposes, and you can get this money if you spend it on one of three things: affordable housing, open space acquisition, and historic preservation. Now, those are three constituencies which have often fought with each other over the years. But because a really genius young man, Bob Keene, put this legislation together years ago, secured a state match for the funds you raised at the local level. Those three constituencies support that bill actively. And they have helped to generate millions and millions of dollars for local communities that could be used for any of those three things. Must spend 10% on each of those items, and then a committee meets to decide how to divvy up the rest of the 70% between those items. So in Cambridge, for example, we always spend 80% on affordable housing, 10% on historic preservation, 10% on open space acquisition. In other towns, they'll reverse those numbers, right? But the point is, all three constituencies believe that this is worth doing. So one of the things, my message is to younger folks is, look for other constituencies, look for allies in places you might normally think you will find allies. I think, for example, the allies between the public health arena and the housing arena, between the environmental arena and the housing arena, between the educational arena and the housing arena, are full of possibility for the ways we could act to the benefit of both of those constituencies. And I would like us to be better at building those liaisons across what we have always considered as silo walls.
Well, Jim, you have achieved so much. You've been involved in so many different things in the area of housing and communities. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners and viewers?
Well, it was an interesting column, a letter to the editor in the Globe this morning by somebody who said, "I'm selfish, and so I want the following things to happen. I'm selfish, so I want people to wear masks so that I will stay healthy and they will stay healthy and I won't have to pay their extra emergency room bills." It was an intriguing kind of a way of stating things differently than you expected when you read the title of the letter. And what I'm frustrated by, Dan, is my own inability to explain to people all of the really important benefits for all of us by making sure that all of us have a decent place to live at a price we can afford. All of the health outcomes, the educational outcomes, the mental health outcomes that result from bad housing eventually end up costing our whole society not only money, but frustration and sadness and disorganization and disarray. And we would, if all of our people had a decent place to live at a price they could afford, our society would be so much better off. And I'm frustrated at my inability to more effectively explain that to a wider range of people. So we have a long way to go. I'm lucky to still have a chance to be active in some of those arenas where we can still fight for those things. But I'm anxious for somebody smarter than me to be able to find the secret to everybody to suddenly having a groundswell of feelings that we must do this. When I was in Scotland a few years ago for 6 months studying social housing in Scotland, I discovered after a couple of interviews, and then I kept asking people this question, and I always got a yes answer. I said, it seems to me that here in Scotland, your attitude is everybody should have a decent place to live. And it's the responsibility of the public sector to make sure that happens one way or another. Is that right? And everybody would say to me, well, of course. Doesn't everybody feel that way? So I want that to be the way our country works. I want, when our better angels are at work with us, that is the way we act. You know yourself, there's so many stories of incredible generosity among our people, an incredible understanding of how we're all better off when each of us has the resources we need to lead our best lives. So that's my dream, and I'm going to keep working on that. until people tell me I can't anymore.
It's kind of the concept of all for one and one for all.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for taking your time for this and sharing your thoughts with us. You know, so many arenas that you've been in, and I think the history is great and your hopes for the future, I really hope are realized.
Thanks so much, Nan. It was an honor to be asked to be a part of this by you and by Kent and by others. Thank you very much for including me. I'm very honored.
Thank you.